The sun over the Napa Valley did not shine, it hammered the earth. It was a relentless, bleached white heat that turned the vineyards into shimmering mirages and silenced the birds in the olive trees. The air was thick with the scent of dry grass and dust, a suffocating blanket that pressed against the windows of Lyra's aging sedan as she navigated the winding private road. Lyra checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. At 26, she possessed a face that people often described as calm, though she knew it was simply the mask she wore to survive. She was a trauma physical therapist, a woman whose life was defined by the breaking point of others. She spent her days coaxing movement into shattered limbs and whispering courage into ears that had forgotten the sound of hope. She was good at her job because she understood pain. She knew that pain was not just a physical sensation, but a language, a scream that had nowhere to go. She had been hired by the Caldwell estate not because of her prestige, but because she was the only one willing to take the contract. The previous 3 therapists had quit within a week. The salary was exorbitant, enough to clear her student loans and perhaps buy her a life that didn't feel like a constant struggle for air. But as the wrought iron gates of the estate loomed ahead, towering and rusted shut like the jaws of a trap, Lyra felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the car's failing air conditioning. The truth is a jagged edge. The tighter you hold it, the deeper it cuts. The Caldwell mansion sat atop the highest hill, a sprawling architectural beast of stone and glass that looked out of place among the golden, sun-scorched hills. It was a house built to intimidate, to dominate the landscape. It was a fortress, and inside that fortress lived a ghost. Finn Caldwell. The name carried weight in the valley. The Caldwells were old money, the kind that bought silence and buried scandals under foundations of marble. Finn was the heir, the golden boy who had disappeared from the society pages 6 months ago after the accident. The details were scarce, scrubbed clean by high-priced lawyers. All Lyra knew was that he was broken, and he refused to be fixed. She parked her car on the pristine gravel driveway. The silence here was heavy, oppressive. It wasn't the peace of nature, it was the stillness of a held breath. She was met at the heavy oak door by a housekeeper with a face like chiseled granite. Mrs. Gable didn't smile. She simply led Lyra through a labyrinth of cool, darkened hallways where the curtains were drawn tight against the invasion of the sun. The house smelled of lemon polish and stale grief. "He is in the West Wing," Mrs. Gable said, her voice a hushed whisper. "He does not like the light. He does not like conversation. Do your job, Miss Lyra, but do not expect him to cooperate. He is difficult." "I am used to difficult," Lyra replied softly, clutching her medical bag. "You are used to patients who want to heal," Mrs. Gable corrected, stopping before a set of double doors. "Mr. Caldwell wants to vanish." Mrs. Gable opened the door and stepped aside, leaving Lyra to cross the threshold alone. The room was cavernous, swallowed by shadows. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the relentless afternoon sun, allowing only the faintest slivers of light to cut across the Persian rugs like laser beams. The air was cooler here, refrigerated to a chill that made goosebumps rise on Lyra's arms. At the far end of the room, sitting in a leather armchair facing the darkened fireplace, was a silhouette. Finn Caldwell. He didn't turn when she entered. He sat with a stillness that was unnatural. As Lyra's eyes adjusted to the gloom, she began to make out the details. He was wrapped in a robe, his right leg encased in a heavy, complex brace that extended from his thigh to his ankle. A cane rested against the chair. Even in the dark, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the armrest as if he were bracing for an impact that had already happened. "I told them to stop sending people," a voice came from the chair. It was deep, rough, like gravel grinding together. It was a voice that hadn't been used for kindness in a long time. "I'm not people, Mr. Caldwell," Lyra said, stepping forward, her sneakers squeaking softly on the floor. "I'm Lyra, and I'm not leaving until we complete a session." Finn turned his head slowly. The sliver of light from the curtains caught his face. He was devastatingly handsome, in the way a ruined cathedral is beautiful. Dark hair fell over his forehead unkempt. His jaw was sharp, covered in a week's worth of stubble. But it was his eyes that stopped Lyra in her tracks. They were a piercing, stormy gray, and they were filled with a hostility so raw it felt physical. And then she saw the scar. A thin, jagged line ran from his temple down to his cheekbone, disappearing into the beard. It wasn't a disfigurement, it was a map of violence. Lyra, he repeated her name with mockery. You think you can fix this? He gestured vaguely to his leg, to the room, to his entire existence. I think I can help you walk without that cane, she said, steadying her voice. I don't want to walk, Finn snapped. I want to be left alone in the dark. The dark doesn't heal bone, Mr. Caldwell, Lyra countered, taking another step. She was close enough now to smell him. Soap, old books, and the metallic tang of bitterness. Finn laughed, a harsh, dry sound. You have no idea what broke these bones, little nurse. If you did, you would run back to your car and drive until you hit the ocean. He looked at her then, really looked at her, searching for the fear he was used to inspiring. But Lyra didn't flinch. She saw the aggression. Yes, but beneath it, she saw something else. She saw a terrified animal caught in a trap of its own making. She placed her bag on the table, the sound echoing in the silent room. I'm not running, Lyra whispered. Finn stared at her, the gray eyes narrowing. For a moment, the air between them crackled with electricity, a collision of his immovable despair and her unstoppable resolve. He didn't know it yet, but the girl standing in his shadow was the only person who wouldn't look away from his scars. But as he looked at her, a flicker of genuine fear crossed his face, not for himself, but for her. Because he knew the truth of what lived in this house, and he knew that innocence was the first thing the truth devoured. Then God help you, Finn muttered, turning back to the dark fireplace. Because no one else in this house will. For 14 days, the West Wing remained a kingdom of twilight. Outside, the Napa summer raged on, bleaching the hills to the color of bone, but inside, time was measured only by the rhythmic click of Finn's cane and the shallow sound of his breathing. Lyra's work was a battle of inches. Every morning, she entered the darkened room, bringing with her the faint scent of the outside world, sunscreen, exhaust, and the stubborn hope that defined her existence. And every morning, Finn met her with a wall of silence. He was a difficult patient, rigid and unyielding, treating his own body like an enemy he was forced to inhabit. The physical therapy sessions were intimate by necessity, a forced proximity that blurred the lines between the clinical and the personal. Lyra had to touch him. Her hands, strong and calloused from years of work, kneaded the scar tissue on his thigh, coaxing the atrophied muscles back to life. Finn hated it. He hated the weakness, but more than that, he hated her hands. They were too gentle. They were hands that didn't know the things he had done. You're tensing up, Lyra whispered one afternoon, her fingers pressing into the knot of muscle just above his knee. The room was silent save for the hum of the air conditioning. You have to trust the leg, Finn. It will hold you. It's not the leg I don't trust, Finn muttered, his head thrown back against the leather chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not from heat, but from the exertion of pain. Then trust me, she said softly. Finn lowered his chin, his storm-gray eyes locking onto hers. The distance between them was non-existent. She was kneeling between his legs, her hands on his skin. He looked at her, at the fraying collar of her scrub top, at the cheap plastic watch on her wrist, at the way her hair curled in the humidity. She was everything he wasn't. Alive, unburdened, whole. You shouldn't be here, Lyra, he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her chest. You drive that rusted car up here every day, thinking you're fixing a broken man. You don't realize that some things stay broken for a reason. I don't believe that, Lyra countered, not breaking his gaze. I think you're hiding. There is a difference. We touch the wound to clean it, forgetting that the memory of the blade still lives in the skin. The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't just about the therapy anymore. It was the air between them, charged with a magnetism that was strictly forbidden. She was the help, paid to fix a problem. He was the Caldwell heir, a man whose net worth could buy her entire neighborhood. But in the dark, stripped of titles and pretenses, they were just a man and a woman circling a fire. Later that week, the dynamic fractured further. Lyra had stayed late to file her progress reports. The sun had finally set, and for the first time, the heavy velvet drapes were pulled open slightly, allowing the moonlight to spill onto the terrace. She found Finn standing there, leaning heavily on the stone balustrade, staring out at the valley below. He wasn't wearing his robe. He was dressed in a simple black shirt and trousers, the cane resting forgotten against a chair. He was standing on his own. Lyra stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. He looked like a prince in exile, surveying a kingdom he had burned down. "You're standing," she said, a smile touching her lips. Finn didn't turn. "Don't get used to it. Gravity always wins eventually." Lyra walked out onto the terrace. The night air was warm, smelling of jasmine and dry earth. She stood beside him, careful not to touch him, but close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "Why do you stay in the dark, Finn?" she asked, her voice quiet. "The valley is beautiful." "It's not beautiful," Finn replied, his grip tightening on the stone railing until his knuckles turned white. "It's a cage. Everyone down there, they look up at this hill and see a palace. They don't know it's a prison." He turned to her then. The moonlight softened the jagged scar on his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. He looked at Lyra's profile, at the way the moonlight caught her eyelashes. A look of profound, agonizing longing crossed his face. The look of a starving man watching a feast he cannot touch. "You come from a different world, Lyra," he whispered. "A world where mistakes can be fixed, where you pay a fine and move on. In my world, mistakes are immortal." "I have debts, Finn," Lyra said, turning to face him. "I have a father in a nursing home I can barely afford. I eat cereal for dinner 3 nights a week. Don't talk to me about easy worlds." Finn flinched. He looked at her cheap sneakers, then down at his own expensive Italian loafers. The class divide was a chasm, but her honesty built a bridge right over it. "I would give you everything I have," Finn said, the confession slipping out before he could stop it. "The money, the house, the name. I would trade it all just to have your conscience." He reached out. His hand trembled slightly as it moved toward her face. Lyra stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He wanted to touch her. She wanted him to. His fingers grazed her cheek, rough and tentative. It was a touch of reverence. "You are dangerous, Lyra," he breathed, "because you make me want to wake up." For a second, the world stopped. There was no accident, no secret, no contract. Just the touch of his hand and the terrifying possibility of hope. But the moment was shattered by the sound of tires crunching on gravel below. Finn pulled his hand back instantly, the vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of panic. He looked over the balcony. A black sedan had parked in the driveway, not Lyra's car and not a delivery. It was sleek, official, and ominous. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. Finn's face went pale, the color draining away until the scar stood out like a fresh wound. He grabbed his cane, his posture collapsing back into the broken invalid. "Who is that?" Lyra asked, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "The architects," Finn whispered, his voice dripping with venom and fear. "My father's lawyers." He turned to Lyra, grabbing her arm with a desperate intensity. "Go," he commanded. "Leave through the kitchen. Don't let them see you. Don't let them talk to you." "Why?" Finn, what's going on? They aren't here to check on my leg, Lyra, he hissed, pushing her toward the door. They are here to make sure I'm still silent. If they think you know anything, if they think we are close, they will fire you. Or worse. Lyra looked at him, confused and frightened. What don't I know, Finn? Enough to destroy us both, he replied. He turned away from her, limping back into the shadows to face the men in suits, leaving Lyra standing on the terrace, cold despite the heat, realizing that the man she was falling for wasn't just broken. He was a prisoner, and she had just been caught trying to smuggle him a key. The morning after the black sedan departed, the Caldwell mansion felt different. The air was no longer just stale, it was toxic. The visit from the men in suits had stripped away the fragile intimacy of the terrace, replacing it with the cold, hard machinery of business. The curtains in the west wing were drawn tight again, sealing the room in an artificial night that refused to let the dawn in. Lyra arrived at her usual time, her heart heavy with questions she knew she shouldn't ask. Mrs. Gable met her at the door, her face impassive, blocking the entrance for a fraction of a second too long before stepping aside. It was a subtle warning. You are an outsider. Remember your place. When Lyra entered the therapy room, Finn was not in his chair. He was standing by the fireplace, leaning heavily on his cane, pouring a glass of amber liquid that definitely wasn't water. It was 10 a.m. We have a session, Finn, Lyra said, placing her bag down. She tried to keep her voice steady, to bridge the distance that had opened up overnight. Cancel it, Finn said, not turning around. He downed the drink in one swallow. I'm not in the mood to be fixed today. You were walking last night, Lyra pressed, stepping closer. You were standing on the terrace. You were ready. Last night was a mistake, Finn snapped, turning to face her. His eyes were bloodshot, the storm-gray iris swallowed by a dark, dilated pupil. The vulnerability she had seen under the moonlight was gone, replaced by a defensive, aristocratic sneer. I forgot who I was, and I forgot who you were. Lyra flinched. The rejection was sharp, but it was the mess on the floor that caught her eye. Near the foot of his chair, a blue legal folder had been thrown with enough force to scatter its contents across the expensive Persian rug. It looked like trash, discarded and forgotten in a drunken rage. But in the chaotic scatter of papers, one page stood out face up. A settlement agreement, a non-disclosure agreement, and a wire transfer receipt for $2 million. The recipient's name was listed clearly, the family of Elena Santos. Lyra froze. She knew that name. Elena Santos was a local girl from the valley, the daughter of a vineyard worker who had been paralyzed in a hit-and-run 6 months ago. The police had never found the driver. The case had gone cold. Lyra looked from the scattered papers on the floor to Finn. The jagged scar on his face suddenly looked less like a wound and more like a receipt for a crime. Elena Santos, Lyra whispered, the air leaving her lungs. You paid them. Finn followed her gaze to the floor. He stiffened, his hand gripping the cane until the wood groaned. He didn't deny it. He didn't rush to explain. He simply stared at her with a look of utter desolation. You were the driver, Lyra said, her voice rising, shaking with a mixture of horror and betrayal. The accident. It wasn't an accident, was it? You hit her. You drove away, and then you bought her silence. It's not what you think, Finn said, but the words lacked conviction. He sounded tired, defeated. It looks exactly like what I think. Lyra cried, backing away from him. I thought you were hiding because you were hurt. I thought you were broken. But you're hiding because you're guilty. You're hiding because you're a coward who used his father's money to bury a girl's life. The truth is a jagged edge. The tighter you hold it, the deeper it cuts. Stop, Finn warned, stepping toward her, his cane hitting the floor with a dull thud. You don't know the whole story, Lyra. You only see the ink on the page. I see a man who thinks he can buy his way out of hell, Lyra spat back, her professional mask shattering completely. "I trusted you. I touched your scars. I thought you were different. I am not different." Finn roared, the anger exploding out of him. "I am a Caldwell. This is what we do. We survive. We fix the mess." He stooped down, pain flashing across his face, grabbed the folder from the floor, and threw it into the fire. The paper caught instantly, curling and blackening, erasing the evidence. But the image was burned into Lyra's mind. "I can't treat you," Lyra said, grabbing her bag, her hands trembling violently. "I can't touch you." Not knowing what those hands did, Finn looked at her. He saw the disgust in her eyes. He saw the light of the previous night extinguished, replaced by judgment. He knew he could tell her the truth right now. He could tell her who was really driving the car that night. He could tell her why he took the fall, why he paid the money, whose life he was actually saving. But if he told her, he would put a target on her back. The architects, his father's lawyers, were watching. If Lyra knew the real secret, she would be a liability. And liabilities in the Caldwell world were eliminated. To save her, he had to destroy her faith in him. He had to become the villain she accused him of being. Finn straightened his spine. He locked his jaw. He summoned the arrogance he had been raised to wield like a weapon. "You're right," Finn said coldly, his voice devoid of emotion. "You can't treat me, because you're fired." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He scribbled a number on it, hastily, aggressively. He tore the check out and held it toward her. "This should cover your time, and your silence regarding what you saw today." Lyra stared at the check. It was a payout, just like the one for Elena Santos. He was trying to buy her, too. "I am not one of your victims, Finn," Lyra whispered, tears finally spilling over. "And I am not for sale." She didn't take the check. She let it fall from his hand. It fluttered to the floor, landing on the rug like a piece of trash. "Get out," Finn said, turning his back to her, facing the fire that was consuming the settlement papers. "Go back to your small life, Lyra. Leave the monsters to the dark." Lyra stood there for a heartbeat, waiting for him to turn, waiting for the crack in the armor. But he remained stone. She turned and walked out of the West Wing. She walked through the silent hallways, past Mrs. Gable, who watched her go with knowing eyes, and out the heavy oak door. The heat of the valley hit her like a physical blow, drying the tears on her face instantly. She got into her car, her hands slipping on the steering wheel, and drove away from the fortress on the hill. Behind her, in the darkened room, Finn watched her dust trail disappear. He fell into his chair, the cane clattering to the floor, and buried his face in his hands. He had successfully protected the secret, and he had successfully saved her from the crossfire. But as he sat in the silence, he realized that by saving her, he had damned himself to be exactly what she thought he was. A man alone in the dark, with nothing but money to keep him warm. 3 days passed in a haze of suffocating heat. Lyra tried to return to her routine, but the image of Finn alone in the dark, destroying the evidence of his own guilt, was a splinter in her mind she couldn't remove. She should have hated him. The logic was simple. He was a rich, careless man who had bought his freedom. But Lyra's heart, stubborn and intuitive, refused to align with the logic. The man who had looked at the moon with such longing, who had touched her cheek with trembling reverence, did not fit the profile of a remorseless criminal. A lie is a shield that eventually crushes the man holding it. Driven by a restless insomnia that kept her pacing her small apartment until dawn, Lyra did the one thing Finn had inadvertently dared her to do. She looked for the rest of a story. She didn't go to the police. She went to the source. She drove to the private rehabilitation center where Elena Santos was being kept, the one funded by the Caldwell millions. Using her medical credentials, she bluffed her way past the front desk, claiming she was a specialist consulted for a second opinion. She found Elena's mother, Maria, sitting in the hallway, clutching a rosary. But it wasn't the rosary that stopped Lyra. It was the object on the small table beside Maria, a crumpled newspaper clipping with Finn Caldwell's face on it. Maria wasn't cursing the image, she was praying over it. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Lyra whispered, sitting beside the older woman. "But I need to understand. Why do you pray for the man who destroyed your daughter?" Maria looked at Lyra, her eyes weary and filled with a terrifying conflict. She looked at the expensive equipment in the room, then at the photo of Finn. "The world calls him a monster," Maria whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of a secret she was paid to keep. "But a monster does not run into the fire, señorita. A monster runs away." Lyra felt the ground shift beneath her. "Runs into the fire," she pressed gently. Maria closed her eyes, a single tear escaping. "The man in the photo, he dragged my Elena out of the wreckage. He burned his hands. He screamed for help. The other one, the driver, he ran into the vineyard. He disappeared." Maria stopped, realizing she had said too much, and turned away abruptly. "The checks clear every month. That is all that matters." But Lyra didn't need to hear any more. The pieces clicked together with a horrifying clarity. Finn wasn't the monster. He was the martyr. The jagged scar on his face, the shattered leg, they weren't injuries from a drunken joyride. They were the scars of a rescue attempt. He had been crushed trying to save a stranger while the real driver fled the scene. And there was only one person Finn Caldwell would destroy his own life to protect. His father. Lyra didn't remember driving back to the Caldwell estate. She only remembered the burning sensation of injustice in her chest. She ignored the security guard at the gate, driving straight up to the main house. She didn't knock. She pushed open the heavy oak doors and stormed into the silent, air-conditioned tomb of the foyer. "Finn!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the marble walls. Mrs. Gable appeared from the shadows, looking alarmed. "Miss Lyra, you cannot be here." "He is not? Get out of my way," Lyra said, her voice carrying a steel she didn't know she possessed. She went straight to the west wing. The doors were closed. She threw them open. The room was darker than ever, the air thick with the smell of stale alcohol. Finn was sitting on the floor by the cold fireplace, surrounded by shattered glass. He had broken a mirror. He looked up as she entered, his face pale, the scar vivid against his skin. He looked like a man waiting for the executioner. "I told you to leave," Finn rasped, not moving. "I told you I was a monster." "You lied," Lyra said, walking toward him. She didn't stop until she was standing directly over him. "I spoke to Maria Santos. She told me about the man who ran into the fire." Finn flinched as if she had struck him. The color drained from his face completely. "Lyra, stop. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what you did," she said, her voice shaking with tears. "You pulled her out. You saved her life. And you let your father run away." Finn struggled to his feet, grabbing his cane, desperate to regain some height, some defense. "He is the head of this family," Finn shouted, the vein in his neck pulsing. "If he goes down, the estate, the company, the workers, everything collapses. I was the spare heir, Lyra. I was disposable. He was essential. You are not disposable." Lyra screamed back, grabbing the lapels of his shirt, forcing him to look at her. "You took the blame for a coward. You let him break your body, and then you let him break your name. Why, Finn? Why would you protect a man who left you to die in a fire?" "Because it was my duty," Finn roared, his voice cracking, the tears finally spilling over. "Because he told me that if I loved this family, I would take the fall. And I believed him. I thought if I fixed his mistake, I would finally be worth something to him." He collapsed against the mantel, the cane slipping from his hand. "But he never visited," Finn whispered, the fight draining out of him. 6 months. He never visited me once. He just sent the lawyers to make sure I kept my mouth shut." Lyra looked at the broken man before her. He wasn't hiding from the police. He was hiding from the heartbreak of a son who realized his father loved his reputation more than his child. The truth is a jagged edge. The tighter you hold it, the deeper it cuts. He doesn't define your worth, Finn, Lyra said softly, stepping into his space. You saved a girl's life. That is who you are. You are the man who stayed. I am a cripple living in a lie, Finn choked out, unable to meet her eyes. I have nothing to offer you, Lyra. The world thinks I'm a criminal. If you stay, they will paint you with the same brush. Let them paint, Lyra whispered. She reached out and took his face in her hands. His skin was cold, clammy with shock. She brushed her thumb over the scar, the mark of his heroism, not his shame. I'm not looking for a saint, Finn, she said, her voice fierce and tender. And I'm not looking for a villain. I'm looking for the man who tried to push me away to save me. I'm looking for you. Finn looked at her, his storm-gray eyes wide with disbelief. He had spent 6 months building a fortress of guilt to keep everyone out. And this woman, this physical therapist with a cheap watch and the stubborn heart, had just kicked the door down. You should run, Finn warned, though his hands came up to grip her wrists, holding her there, terrified she might actually listen. My father, if he knows you know, we'll deal with him, Lyra promised. But right now you need to stand. Not for him. For yourself. She didn't pull away. She leaned her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of him dust, sorrow, and now a faint, trembling hope. Finn let out a shuddering breath, his defenses crumbling. He closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, finally allowing the weight of the lie to slide off his shoulders. They stood together in the shadows of the West Wing, 2 people against a dynasty, realizing that the only way to survive the coming storm was to hold on to each other. The dawn that broke over the Napa Valley the next morning was not the oppressive, bleaching white heat of the days before. It was a soft, bruised purple that bled into gold, a gentler light for a world that had been turned upside down. Inside the West Wing, the heavy velvet drapes, which had guarded the room like prison bars for 6 months, were finally pulled open. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light, swirling around the packed suitcases standing by the door. Finn Caldwell stood by the window, looking out at the vineyards that stretched to the horizon. He was dressed in trousers and a linen shirt, leaning on his cane, but his posture had changed. The slump of the defeated was gone, replaced by the rigid, terrifying tension of a man about to jump off a cliff. He wasn't leaving just a house. He was defecting from a dynasty. Lyra stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. She didn't hurry him. She knew that he was saying goodbye to the ghost of a son he had tried so hard to be, the loyal soldier who had thrown himself on a grenade to save a general who never looked back. Mrs. Gable is waiting by the car, Lyra whispered. She didn't try to stop us. She knows, Finn replied, his voice rough but steady. She's been the warden of this place for 30 years. She knows when a prisoner has finally found the key. He turned to look at the room one last time. He looked at the empty wheelchair he had refused to leave, the shattered mirror he had broken in a rage, and the cold fireplace where he had burned the evidence of his own martyrdom. If I walk out that door, Finn said, meeting Lyra's eyes, the war begins. My father won't let me leave quietly. The lawyers, the press, they will come for us. Let them come, Lyra said, her chin lifting with a defiance that matched his own. The truth is loud, Finn. It's much harder to silence than a lie. Finn looked at her, this woman who had driven up his hill with nothing but a medical bag and a stubborn heart, and he realized she was the strongest thing he had ever known. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. I have nothing to give you but a fight, he warned. I've been fighting my whole life. Lyra smiled, though her eyes were wet. I'm just glad I finally have someone on my side. They walked out of the room together. They walked through the silent, museum-like hallways of the mansion, their footsteps echoing on the marble. They didn't look back. They stepped out onto the gravel driveway, and for the first time in half a year, Finn Caldwell felt the sun on his face without flinching. He stopped at Lyra's battered sedan. Mrs. Gable stood there, her hands clasped in front of her apron. The housekeeper looked at the bags, then at Finn's scar, and finally at Lyra. For the first time in living memory, the granite face softened. "Take the coast road," Mrs. Gable advised, her voice a dry rustle. "The signal is better there, in case you need to call the authorities." It was an admission and a blessing. She knew the truth about the accident. She had always known. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Finn said. He got into the passenger seat of the cheap car, leaving the sleek black limousines of his father's fleet gathering dust in the garage. As Lyra started the engine and the car crunched down the winding driveway, Finn watched the fortress on the hill shrink in the side mirror until it was just a speck of stone against the vast blue sky. 3 months later, the air smelled of salt and pine, not dust and grapes. They had driven until they hit the ocean, just as Finn had predicted. They found a small, weathered rental on the cliffs of Mendocino, a place where the fog rolled in thick and protective, and the sound of the crashing waves drowned out the noise of the past. The legal battle was raging in the city, miles away. Finn had gone to the district attorney. He had given a statement. He had handed over the bank records. It was a scandal that shattered the Caldwell name, but it had liberated the man. His father was facing indictment, the family accounts were frozen, and Finn was facing a future that was uncertain, messy and beautifully his own. On a cool, overcast afternoon, Lyra sat on the back porch, watching Finn walk along the cliff's edge. He still used the cane, but he moved with a new grace. The physical limp remained, but the spiritual paralysis was gone. He stopped and turned, looking back at the house, looking for her. He waved. Lyra walked out to meet him, the wind whipping her hair across her face. When she reached him, he didn't say a word. He simply wrapped his free arm around her waist and pulled her into him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning world. "Does it still hurt?" Lyra asked softly, touching the scar on his temple. "Sometimes," Finn admitted, lifting his head to look at the gray horizon. "But it's a clean pain now. It's healing." He looked down at his hands, hands that were no longer clenched in fists, hands that had stopped paying for silence and started building a life. "I spent so long holding on to the lie," Finn whispered, the sea spray dampening his face. "I thought if I let go, I would bleed to death. The truth is a jagged edge. The tighter you hold it, the deeper it cuts." "But you let go," Lyra reminded him. "You opened your hand, and I found yours," he finished. He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of the ocean and redemption. It wasn't the kiss of a fairy tale prince. It was the kiss of a survivor who had walked through the fire and found the person waiting on the other side with a glass of water. They stood on the edge of the continent, watching the waves batter the rocks below. They had no fortune. They had no dynasty. The road ahead was paved with court dates and public scrutiny. But as Lyra rested her head on his shoulder and Finn rested his chin on her head, they knew they had won the only victory that mattered. He had broken his body to save a stranger, and he had broken his silence to save himself. But it was the woman standing beside him who had saved his soul, simply by refusing to leave him in the dark. Finn Caldwell looked at the vast, terrifyingly open sky and finally exhaled. She had come to the fortress to fix a broken leg, never suspecting that she would be the one to teach the prisoner that the only way to heal a heart is to break the cage that holds it.